The emergency session of the Spiral Tribunal began with all the ceremonial restraint of a reactor breach. Delegates from 72 member polities sat in concentric tiers beneath the rotating star map dome, while the central dais reconfigured itself into Vordrani geometry, hard angles and converging spines that suggested a throat closing. At the center stood Prosecutor Mein Tharn, a composite body carrying 6 cranial helms and 1 speaking mouth, each helm lit by synchronized pulses. The pulses matched the telemetry feed streaming behind him, human rescue ships taking fire while shielding civilian transports in the Carthai corridor. Tharn let the silence hold until the footage reached its most vulnerable frame, then declared, "The species designated human has been found guilty of compassion in a combat zone." Across the chamber, the Vordrani delegation flexed in perfect unison, armored forelimbs striking the floor once, a sound like a single verdict. Their doctrine had never pretended to be ethical, it called itself efficient. Under the old combat efficiency statutes, resource retention outranked all independent rights claims, and tactical utility defined legality. The Vordrani had built an empire on that framework, folding 12 smaller civilizations into labor castes, relay castes, and brood castes, while insisting that identity itself was a pre-technological superstition. They did not negotiate with persons. They negotiated with functions. Humans, with their separate command channels and volunteer medics, looked to them like a disease of fragmentation that had somehow reached the stars. Tharn extended 2 manipulators, and the footage split into a dozen tactical overlays. "Observe the irrationality," he said, voice flattened by machine harmonics. Human capital vessels diverted from offensive opportunities to extract non-combatants from an active kill envelope. Human Marines boarded disabled hostile craft to retrieve wounded enemy operators. Human escorts shielded independent medics not integrated into a sovereign command lattice. This behavior degraded strike tempo by 31% and increased fuel expenditure by 19%. It is not morality. It is operational failure disguised as virtue. He let the final word carry contempt. Compassion is a liability profile. Liability in war is criminal negligence. High Commander Jack rose from the Vordrani military tier before the chair recognized him, which for any other species would have triggered censure. The tribunal registrar remained silent. Jack was physically singular by Vordrani standards, larger than his attendants, cranial ridges plated in black tactical alloy, throat ports glowing with relay traffic. He looked toward the human bench as if studying an artifact in poor repair. "For 3 campaign cycles," he said, each sentence arriving with clipped precision, "we have tested this species and found no coherent center. They are undisciplined fragments pretending to be an army. They call hesitation conscience. They call waste mercy. They preserve hostile tissue, then ask why they bleed resources. In our records, this is not civilization. It is noise." A ripple moved through neutral delegates, especially among the smaller protectorates whose shipping lanes depended on humanitarian corridors. None of them interrupted. Jack continued, emboldened by their quiet. "The hive has no fear of fragmented minds. We face superior numbers with superior unity. We absorb irregular systems and convert inefficiency into order. Where humans preserve enemy life, we remove future resistance. Where humans negotiate with independent medics, we synchronize command under one will. Where humans waste momentum escorting civilians, we complete campaigns." His gaze did not leave Ambassador Elena Morrison. "History selects coherent structures. Debris is not consulted." Tharn called up the next exhibit, a Vordrani strike brief showing planned incursions into relief zones marked by international medical glyphs. The chamber temperature seemed to drop, though nothing in the climate grid changed. The Karthai corridor, the prosecutor mind said, contains unauthorized mobility channels currently exploited by human-associated actors. We will reclassify those channels as contested throughput and eliminate all obstructions. Any vessel maintaining false neutrality inside kinetic theater will be processed as a shield asset for enemy war-making. Humanity may comply by withdrawing. He turned 1 degree toward Morrison. Or it may persist and be corrected. Elena Morrison stood without haste, one hand on the rail, dark, formal uniform plain beside the ornamental legal attire around her. Her voice carried cleanly through the chamber, not loud, not strained, each word placed like a filed edge. For 2 centuries, the United Human Systems have treated surrender protocols, medical neutrality, and civilian evacuation corridors as non-negotiable law. We have enforced those protections against pirates, insurgencies, and state actors, including our own when necessary. Any force that weaponizes those protections is not misunderstood. It is in violation. Withdraw your fleets from occupied relief zones immediately. You have one final opportunity to disengage before dismantlement operations begin. Jack's reply came with cold amusement that was almost theatrical. Ambassador, you speak as if your species enforces law by consensus. We enforce reality by integration. You offer final opportunities because you fear terminal outcomes. We do not. The hive will correct human inefficiency by absorbing every isolated mind into useful silence. Several Vordrani attendants struck the floor again. Retain your corridors if sentiment requires. We will use them to channel targets. The tribunal adjourned in procedural language that fooled no one. By the end of that cycle, secure traffic showed Vordrani spear fleets staging along the Karthai approaches, relay buoys lighting in geometric chains, logistics barges shifting behind assault screens. In public channels, they framed it as a policing action against hazardous doctrine. In military channels, they called it a demonstration campaign. The phrase circulating through Vordrani command feeds was simple: cure the human defect. Elena crossed from the chamber into the human delegation vault where acoustic shielding muted the outer corridors. Admiral David Hayes waited there in field dress rather than diplomatic black, silver thread rank marks catching the low light. He had spent 30 years in fleet operations and wore patience the way other officers wore armor. They submitted strike geometry before the vote closed, he said, passing her a holoslate. They wanted us to see confidence. Elena scanned the projected vectors and nodded once. Confidence is useful. It hardens patterns. Hayes almost smiled. Our analysts said the same. Long memory has enough historical relay signatures to start pruning their lattice the moment they commit. On the command deck of the carrier Resolute Meridian, Captain Sarah Anderson watched the corridor map bloom with red arrows and yellow civilian transponder streams threading between them. Her executive officer asked whether they should consolidate under tight central control once Vordrani jamming began. Anderson shook her head. No single throat to cut, she said. Task groups break into micro-commands at blackout threshold. Every ship captain executes corridor protection according to local geometry, not waiting for permission from a dead channel. The officer hesitated, still trained by older coalition doctrine. That will look chaotic. Anderson's answer was almost dry. To an enemy that worships synchronization, yes, that is the point. At Karthai Medical Anchorage 2, Commander Anna Petrov reviewed casualty intake drills while independent relief crews from 5 polities checked docking clamps and triage modules. None of them belonged to a unified military chain, and all of them had refused evacuation orders until their patients moved first. Petrov sent a secure burst to Fleet Command. Treatment capacity ready, surgical teams distributed, neutral glyphs illuminated on all hulls despite likely hostile fire. When a junior doctor asked whether they would render aid to captured Vordrani if the corridor collapsed, Petrov answered, without drama, "We treat who comes through the hatch breathing. Policy does not expire because someone shoots at it." In Intelligence Fault 7, beneath Luna Defense Ring, Director Marcus Sullivan stood before a wall of campaign archives spanning 187 years of intercepted Vordrani relay behavior, skirmish logs, tribunal transcripts, and forgotten piracy cases where Vordrani auxiliaries had tested swarm timing against human convoys. Analysts called the database long memory protocol because it never deleted precedent, only reweighted it. Sullivan briefed the Joint Response Board in clipped sequence: probable ingress axes, expected lattice update intervals, known vulnerability windows when relay chains overcorrected under contradictory stimuli. "They think history is dead mass," he said. "For us, history is targeting data with legal context." By the second week after the tribunal session, civilian corridors had been converted into layered defense architecture without changing their outward humanitarian profile. Escort destroyers hid behind hospital silhouettes at lawful standoff ranges. Mines remained dormant in debris shears where no evacuation lane passed. Quantum noise buoys waited cold in cargo shells marked as relief infrastructure, legal until activated. The Vordrani interpreted restraint as inertia and posted mock analyses across open channels, predicting human retreat once attrition curves steepened. Human command let the commentary circulate. Elena signed the final warning packet and transmitted it one more time to Vordrani High Command, treaty format, full legal citations, withdrawal window clearly stamped. The acknowledgement came from Jack himself. Single line, no signature flourish. Compliance rejected. Integration proceeding. Hayes read it on the Meridian Bridge while convoy clocks ticked toward first contact. Around him, human officers moved with deliberate economy, not bravado, each station running checklists that treated civilians and warships as one protection problem, rather than separate theaters. Through the forward screens, the Carthage corridor looked calm, starfields and transit beacons suspended in indifferent black. Then the outer sensors registered the first synchronized Vordrani spear fleet entering range in mathematically perfect formation, and every human captain in the network received the same standing order Elena had authored and Parliament had ratified 2 centuries earlier: hold the corridor, hold, preserve the living, break the violators. The first Vordrani spear fleet crossed the outer beacon line and did not slow for identification protocols. Their formation held an unnerving geometric purity. Hundreds of war hulls sliding through the Carthage dark in converging wedges, every turn synchronized to the same microsecond as if a single hand moved them across a tactical board. On the Meridian Bridge, Admiral David Hayes watched their telemetry settle into prediction models that were already familiar from long memory archives and said, quietly, "They came exactly as advertised." Captain Sarah Anderson stood 3 decks below on the Resolute Meridian's local command tier, one eye on convoy drift and one on jammer rise curves. Civilian traffic still filled the corridor, relief barges and medical tenders moving under legal glyphs bright enough to be seen on optical scopes. The first Vordrani transmission arrived on all bands before human challenge signals finished queuing. By decree of Vordrani Corrective Authority, channels Carthage 9 through Carthage 15 are reclassified as contested throughput. Unauthorized neutral markers are void. Human vessels will power down, submit boarding access, and surrender independent medical operators for administrative integration. Noncompliance confirms strategic irrationality and authorizes total restructuring. The message repeated in 12 trade languages and 1 machine code family used by tribunal monitors. It was not only an order, it was theater, written to make any refusal look unlawful. Ambassador Elena Morrison stood in the Meridian's legal communications alcove, linked to the bridge by hardline and to the Spiral Tribunal's emergency observer net by encrypted burst. She listened to the decree once, then sent a final response on open channels, treaty formatted, timestamps and citations embedded. This is Ambassador Elena Morrison for the United Human Systems. You are operating inside protected evacuation and medical corridors recognized by signed interstellar law and acknowledged in your own prior filings. Withdraw all assault elements from relief lanes immediately. Cease fire on marked civilian and medical craft. Acknowledge surrender rights and safe passage terms. If you continue hostile action against protected traffic, your fleet will be designated an unlawful aggressor formation and dismantled. There was a narrow pause, long enough for every ship in range to hear a choice being offered one last time. Then, High Commander Jack answered directly, his voice granular through the carrier noise, each word fed through relay harmonics that made it sound less spoken than stamped. Ambassador Morrison, your species continues to confuse emotional ritual with enforceable order. We reject your premise, your citations, and your jurisdiction. Civilian distinction is a camouflage behavior. Medical neutrality is a throughput exploit. Independent identity is an efficiency defect. We will terminate all corridor irregularity, seize all unaffiliated personnel, and absorb all command fragment assets into useful silence. You may preserve your doctrine as a memorial entry after integration. Across the bridge, a young signals officer swallowed and kept working. Hayes did not raise his voice. Record and authenticate. Full distribution to tribunal monitors and neutral freight channels. Jack finished with the contempt he had used in the chamber, only colder now that weapons were live. You are still being corrected, Admiral. You have mistaken our patience for distance. The insult became action 6 seconds later. A Vorodrani forward lance sheared through a medical navigation buoy marked with humanitarian glyphs. Then a second strike clipped a relief tug that was towing life support pallets toward Anchorage 2. The tug spun, venting atmosphere in a pale arc. Engines dead, but hull intact. No cinematic warning shot followed, no demand for evacuation. The Spear fleet simply began clearing legal markers out of its path. On Carthay Medical Anchorage 2, Commander Anna Petrov's display flooded with distress pings. Tug Halcyon crippled, crew alive, requesting tow. 2 civilian shuttles with propulsion loss, outer triage ring still stable. She keyed Fleet Command. They are targeting protected infrastructure deliberately. Hayes answered. Confirmed. Recovery window opens now. Execute. Elena received one more line from Jack, private channel this time stripped of formal register. Watch your fragments drown in their own exceptions. She forwarded it into evidence vaults without comment. 90 seconds after the first hostile strike, Hayes stepped into the command well where every tactical station could see him and spoke in the same measured cadence Elena had used at Tribunal. Rules remain in force. We do not abandon civilians. We do not target medical hulls. We do not strike brood barges. We disable aggressor combat capability and hold the corridor. Task groups execute blackout doctrine on my mark. His gaze moved from station to station, checking composure more than screens. They wanted a test case. They have one. Anderson received his command as the jammer wave hit full strength and central targeting links broke into static. Her ships fragmented by design, escort destroyers peeling into microgroups that looked, from outside, like a line collapsing. To Vorodrani algorithms trained on centralized command trees, the picture translated as panic. It was not panic. It was decision. Micro-commands execute Layer 1, Anderson said. Protect convoy spine, pull Halcyon and shuttle group behind beacon debris. Do not chase their bait screens. Her executive officer watched 3 Vordrani wedges punch through the gap where a single human line should have been and said, "They think we broke." "They need to think that for 8 more minutes," Anderson replied. At the edge of the battlefield, Vordrani tactical conductor Kareth fed the human movement data into the lattice and felt the expected satisfaction ripple through the command net. Human formations were no longer coherent blocks, their signatures scattered, vector variance rising, command bursts asynchronous. Disorder, exactly as doctrine predicted. Kareth flagged fragment collapse likely and requested acceleration of integration boarding craft for medical anchors. High Commander Jack's acknowledgement came as a pulse of approval across the Hive channel. "Press, remove corridor markers, sever rescue nodes, capture independent operators first." Kareth sent his spear wings forward in textbook sequence, timing each thrust to overlapping kill cones designed to force retreat corridors inward until evac traffic jammed and stalled. The tactic had broken 3 coalition navies in earlier campaigns. In each case, once civilian traffic choked the lane, defenders had either withdrawn or begun firing through refugees. Both outcomes benefited the Hive. Instead, human ships did something Kareth's models treated as low-probability noise. Small escort pairs broke perpendicular to the pressure line and created moving shield pockets around the convoy hulls, taking glancing hits while tug craft slipped disabled vessels out through narrow windows. A corvette that should have withdrawn cut thrust rotated broadside and used its own hull to absorb fragments from a strike meant for a med transport. Another pair of human ships ignored a clean shot at Kareth's flank to pull lifeboats from a ruptured freight barge. "Wasteful," Kareth tagged. "Irrational." Yet the corridor did not close. On the Meridian, long memory analysts overlaid fresh Vordrani relay behavior against old skirmish archives. Director Marcus Sullivan's voice reached Hayes through a compressed burst, calm even through interference. "They are overcommitting relay density to their forward wedges. We are seeing the same corrective lag from the Rethys piracy actions, only faster. If they keep pushing synchronized updates at this tempo, node strain will crest inside the hour." Hayes asked. "Confidence?" "High," Sullivan said. "They are giving us the pattern we wanted." A Vordrani boarding cluster detached toward Anchorage 2, armored pods in tight spindle formation. Petrov tracked them and requested authorization to scuttle outer triage arms before capture. Hayes denied it. "Hold your station. Escort Group Talon will intercept." Talon arrived late by 2 minutes and ugly by every parade standard, 3 battered frigates and a cutter with 1 engine running hot. They crossed the boarding cluster's path at oblique angles and detonated chaff canisters that bloomed into metallic fog, blinding Vordrani close-in sensors long enough for point defense grids to cut the pod formation apart. Survivors tried to regroup and found human Marines already on their hulls with breaching clamps. Kareth saw the feed and routed contempt through the net. They commit Marines in corridor clutter. Primitive heroics. Then an image hit Vordrani channels from a captured pod. 2 human medics sealing ruptures on an injured drone operator while the operator's restraint harness remained locked. Not a propaganda clip. Not a delayed broadcast, just helmet cam reality pushed into open frequency by a human comms officer who understood what the Hive had no frame for. Kareth attempted to purge the feed. It reappeared through 3 relay paths and bled into tactical overlays. For 0.7 seconds, several local drone clusters hesitated between attack priorities while consensus routines tried to classify the act. Enemy-preserving hostile tissue during active engagement did not map cleanly to any doctrine branch. That hesitation cost the Vordrani 1 boarding wave and nearly cost them a second. "Filter all human medical transmissions," Jack ordered. "Filtering now," Kareth replied, and did not report how many units had already received it. By the third exchange cycle, both fleets had taken damage. Human escorts were scarred and running tight on interceptor stocks. 2 convoy ships burned without propulsion. Crews evacuated under fire. A destroyer from Anderson's right screen lost its dorsal array and still held station with maneuvering thrusters and manual guns. To outside observers, it looked like a thin line stubbornly refusing arithmetic. On the human net, the tone remained clipped and professional. Anchor 2 stable. Halcyon crew transferred. Civilian convoy green spine clear by 40%. Vordrani wedge 3 drifting off sync by 0.4 seconds. Anderson listened to the reports and watched the timing offsets appear where none should have existed in a perfect hive strike. Small gaps, brief late turns, redundant correction bursts. Nothing decisive yet, but enough to prove the first layer was working. She opened a channel to Hayes. "They are still stronger at this range," she said. "If we stay purely defensive, attrition eventually wins for them." Hayes answered, "Agreed. We can start phase needle on your authority." He waited a beat, checking legal overlays and civilian clearance tracks one last time. Every evacuation convoy that could move had moved. Medical hulls were still under threat, but protected lanes remained open. The warning had been issued, repeated, authenticated, and dismissed in action as well as words. Elena stood beside him when he gave the order. "Transmit to all commands," he said. "Unlawful aggressor designation confirmed. Initiate dismantlement operations, long memory protocol phase 1. Preserve surrender channels. Prioritize non-lethal disablement where tactically viable. Break their relay coherence." Across the corridor, human ships that had seemed scattered began pivoting into new vectors, not toward the nearest targets, but toward specific relay points hidden behind Vordrani spearheads. Cold, quantum noise buoys, carried in relief-marked cargo shells since before first contact, received wake signals and came alive in silence. The battlefield still looked chaotic from a distance. Up close, a pattern was forming with deliberate, patient precision. Kareth saw human vectors bend away from easy kills and felt the first non-trivial disturbance in the hive's confidence. "They are not retreating," he sent to Jack. "They are shaping." Jack's answer came sharp as cut metal. "Then we cut faster." Human captains, hearing the same order through different words, made their choice at once and drove deeper into the corridor fire. The first relay spine died so cleanly that half the Vordrani forward wedge kept flying on assumptions for 3 full seconds. Human destroyers did not fire into the densest hull clusters where kills were easiest to count. They struck narrow points behind those clusters, threading tungsten darts and focused pulse bursts through debris seams to sever transmission nodes that looked, to any conventional tactician, too small to matter. On Vordrani displays, command geometry remained intact for a moment, then folded inward like an unstitched seam. 2 drone squadrons turned toward contradictory targets. A boarding element lost lockstep and overshot anchorage 2 by 4,000 kilometers. On the meridian, Hayes watched the change and said, "Confirm split behavior before we commit layer 2. Anderson answered from her fragment command net, breathing steady over the static. "Confirmed on 5 sectors. They are still dangerous, Admiral, but they are no longer singular." Human microgroups moved as if each ship had guessed the same answer independently, which was exactly what Vordrani doctrine had declared impossible for fragmented minds. One corvette captain, isolated by jammer shadow, ignored the published strike package and rolled beneath a burning freight spine to reach a relay beacon long memory had tagged as low priority. She destroyed it, then used the explosion plume as cover to tow a disabled medical skiff toward Petrov's anchorage. Another captain, cut off from central telemetry, identified a Vordrani correction rhythm by visual thruster flare and timed his missiles to arrive between lattice updates. His target survived with engines intact, but its relay mast sheared away, and 3 nearby wings drifted out of mutual timing. No one had ordered either maneuver. No one needed to. Kareth saw the pattern and rejected it at first as sensor corruption. "Reconcile data integrity across all wedge channels," he snapped into the tactical chorus. "Human formations remain incoherent. Their strike effects are statistical noise." The lattice returned a harder answer. Noise did not produce synchronized relay losses across separated fronts. Noise did not repeatedly hit command conduits while bypassing obvious kill opportunities. Kareth reran the probability tree and found his confidence interval collapsing in real time. He opened a direct thread to Jack. "Their fragmentation is deliberate. Individual units are selecting targets without awaiting central authorization. They are trading tactical elegance for adaptive disruption." Jack's response carried the hard edge of doctrine under stress. "Then they are sacrificing coherence, which accelerates defeat. Pressure all fronts. Increase update tempo. Saturate their independence until local initiative becomes local extinction." They tried. Vordrani spearheads surged with renewed force, but the order itself widened the wound. Faster updates required denser relay traffic. Denser traffic created hotter nodes. Hotter nodes gave long memory exactly what Sullivan had predicted. Overcorrection windows where the hive's own urgency became a signature. Human ships that looked scattered from a strategic altitude were, at local range, executing a disciplined hunting pattern against those windows. They let Vordrani holes pass, accepted glancing fire, and struck at the spine behind the claw. Over and over. 19 minutes into Phase 1, the tide shifted from theoretical to visible. A full Vordrani wedge approached Convoy Greenspine with enough mass to overwhelm its escorts, then stalled mid-vector when its lead conductor failed to receive consensus confirmation from 2 adjacent nodes. The pause lasted less than a second, yet in corridor combat, less than a second was a gift. Anderson spent it instantly. "Group Rook, shove the convoy hard to Beacon 12 Shadow. Group Talon crosscut their flank relays. Do not duel their armor." Her ships obeyed without waiting for acknowledgement pings that might never arrive. Talon's battered cutter took a direct hit to its stern, spun, recovered on attitude thrusters, and still planted a shaped charge across a Vordrani relay blister before peeling away. The wedge regained partial sync, but the convoy was gone from its kill lane. At Anchorage 2, Petrov ran triage with one hand and tactical routing with the other. The station's outer ring had taken fragment damage, and docking traffic came in jagged bursts rather than ordered queues. A human marine team dragged in 2 injured Vordrani operators from a disabled pod, armor scorched, neural ports flickering from relay shock. A nurse asked whether to prioritize them behind civilian burns. Petrov did not look up from her display. No ideology in triage. Priority by survivability and time to failure. Mark them as detainee patients and treat. The decision moved through local channels, then through shipboard gossip, then into combat comms where exhausted crews listened between salvos. It was not a speech. It was policy, still functioning under fire. A nearby comms petty officer, running on caffeine and stubbornness, pushed 30 seconds of that treatment feed into open spectrum bands before legal review could stop him. The clip showed a Vordrani medic drone trying to access absent hive instructions, while a human surgeon manually stabilized its patient anyway. By the time command tried to classify the release, neutral freighters had mirrored it, Tribunal observers had archived it, and Vordrani filters were already late. Kareth felt the effect as a microscopic stutter in peripheral units asked to kill enemies who preserved Vordrani life. Doctrine supplied no clean branch for gratitude, no efficient protocol for cognitive dissonance. Small hesitations multiplied where timing had once been absolute. Hayes saw casualty numbers climbing on both sides and refused any temptation to romanticize the moment. Human ships were bleeding fuel and interceptor stocks. One escort died covering a civilian tug. Another limped on emergency power with 40% of crew stations dark. Yet the corridor remained open, and that was the metric that mattered. He keyed a fleet-wide burst. All commands maintain objective discipline. You are not chasing victories. You are preserving lanes and degrading relays. If a Vordrani unit transmits surrender code, capture and secure. If it fires, disable. Keep brood barges off your target list regardless of provocation. Elena, listening beside him, added legal authorization strings and tribunal citations in the same packet, converting tactical restraint into recorded precedent while the battle still raged. Kareth hated the packets because they were evidence, and evidence implied judgment by standards outside the hive. He shifted to private thought space for the first time in years, cutting himself out of full course to analyze without collective smoothing. The silence was thin and frightening. In it, he recognized a possibility he had never needed to name. The hive could be wrong, not in execution, but in premise. They had interpreted human decentralization as weakness because they believed personhood degraded war-making. What he was watching suggested the reverse inside disrupted environments. Independent decision loops were not inefficiency. They were resilience under comms fracture. He reopened Chorus Link quickly, ashamed of the thought even as he could not erase it. Regroup at Lattice Line Cinder, he transmitted to surviving conductors. Re-establish coherence through hardline relay chains. Ignore humanitarian broadcasts. Prioritize destruction of quantum noise sources. A conductor on his left flank answered with uncharacteristic delay. Cinder line unavailable. Human frigates are inside the relay corridor. Another voice cut in, clipped by interference. Request clarification of target hierarchy. Enemy med hulls are providing treatment to captured Vordrani. Are those assets to be preserved for recovery or removed as psychological contamination? Kareth stared at the question as if it were a weapon pointed inward. All enemy assets remain hostile, he said. Classification unchanged. The conductor replied, acknowledged. But the timing of the acknowledgement came 0.3 seconds late. The smallest measurable sign of doubt. Jack entered the channel without invitation, his presence flattening side traffic through force of rank and personality. Conductor Kareth, your wedge losses exceed predictive tolerance. Explain. Kareth gave him numbers stripped of excuses. 13 relay nodes severed, 4 wedges desynchronized beyond optimal correction, boarding operations at Anchorage, 2 degraded, convoy destruction incomplete. He expected punishment protocol. Jack gave him contempt instead. You have been distracted by human theatrics. They broadcast compassion as a cognitive weapon because they lack the will for efficient annihilation. Do not interpret sentiment as strength. Kareth answered with formal restraint that barely hid urgency. With respect, Commander, their sentiment coexists with targeted precision. They are selecting lattice vulnerabilities with high confidence under blackout conditions. Their independent captains are converging on relay priorities without centralized direction. This is not theatrics. It is a combat paradigm we did not model correctly. For a fraction of a moment, the channel held nothing but weapon noise and breathing filters. Then, Jack said, colder than before, then model faster. I am committing reserve spear groups from the rear logistics screen. We will crush their micro-commands by mass and restore full synchronization through brute density. It was the most Vordrani answer possible, and Kareth understood why it might fail before he finished acknowledging it. Brute density would put more holes into the same relay architecture humanity was already cutting apart. Still, doctrine left no procedural lane for strategic humility during active engagement. He issued the orders. By then, the corridor had become a map of local human decisions that should have contradicted each other and did not. A lieutenant on a destroyer named Quiet Harbor rerouted power from aft shielding to a crippled tug tow line long enough to drag 62 civilians behind debris cover, then vented compartments to survive incoming fire. A Marine sergeant leading a boarding team on a disabled Vordrani corvette found the enemy command core fused shut, abandoned breaching plans, and instead mounted a portable jammer directly to the hull to block distress synchronization, while detainees were extracted alive. At no point did either action wait for Admiralty confirmation. When reports reached Hayes, he marked both decisions compliant with objective intent and moved on. The system worked because trust had been designed into it before the shooting started. 3 cycles later, Sullivan's voice returned through the interference with the steadiness of someone reading weather data rather than a battle. Admiral, Phase 1 effect exceeds baseline. Their reserve groups are increasing relay load exactly as projected. We can trigger deeper node pruning if you authorize Phase 1B. Recommend immediate execution before they stabilize. Hayes looked at Elena. She gave a single nod, sharp and certain. Authorized, he said. All units execute 1B. Continue non-lethal priority where viable. Preserve surrender frequencies. Across Vordrani channels, 1B arrived as catastrophe disguised as arithmetic. Human strikes hit not the largest nodes, but the correction nodes that told other nodes how to heal. Wedges that had relied on automatic resynchronization found themselves drifting farther apart each update cycle. Tactical overlays started disagreeing with physical reality. A flank that appeared protected was already open. A reinforcement wing arrived to coordinates that no longer existed as a coherent front. The Hive had built war as one organism. Humanity was not trying to kill the organism quickly. Humanity was isolating its nerves. Kareth finally named the fear he had kept outside language. We are being deconstructed. He transmitted emergency regroup orders to all surviving conductors. Abandon forward integration attempts. Fall back behind logistics barges. Hardlink every available relay spine. Prepare for manual command segmentation if chorus cohesion dropped below threshold. It was a desperate command because manual segmentation was what lesser species used, and Vordrani officers had been taught to regard it as prehistory. Yet as his own channel flickered and another wedge reported contradictory headings from 2 authoritative nodes, Kareth understood that prehistory had just become survival doctrine. His final message to Jack before the pullback carried no rhetoric, only a line he never expected to send. Commander, we underestimated fragmented minds. Request permission to regroup before coherence loss becomes irreversible. Around him, damaged Vordrani holes began turning in uneven arcs toward the rear, trying to become one thing again while human microgroups pressed in with patient, relentless precision. Kareth expected pursuit fire aimed at engines and reactors. Instead, the first human burst that crossed his screens was a coded packet writing emergency medical bandwidth, authenticated with Tribunal keys and mirrored on civilian frequencies so no command sensor could erase it without witnesses. This is Unified Human Corridor Command. Surrender lanes are open on vectors marked white. Disabled vessels that power down weapons will be boarded for rescue and detention. Neural stabilization teams are ready for delink trauma. Brood civilian craft will not be targeted. Repeat, Brood civilian craft will not be targeted. Kareth froze on the phrase neural stabilization teams. Vordrani field doctrine had warned for centuries that separation from full chorus produced terminal cascade, a cognitive unraveling used to discipline officers against independent thought. Human broadcasts were now asserting the opposite, that D-Link could be survived with treatment. He tagged it as manipulation on reflex, but his own tactical board undercut the label. 3 captured Vordrani from earlier boarding actions had been returned on video, alive, sedated, and neurologically stable under human care. On Anchorage 2, Petrov had no spare theatrics and no spare sleep. She stood over a curved operating table where a Vordrani relay specialist trembled in seizure cycles as severed course routines crashed against silent neural ports. 2 human surgeons held the stabilization frame, while a Kithai volunteer anesthetist from an independent relief guild tracked oxygen and cortical load with calm precision. Petrov watched the numbers settle, then nodded to comms. "Record this one clean. Show the monitor, not the patient's face. Push only what proves survivability." The feed moved from MedNet to CommandNet to open space rebroadcast in under 30 seconds. Sullivan had prepared for that exact chain. Inside Vault 7, he and his analysts had spent the last 2 hours translating captured relay architecture into individualized handshake pings, each one tuned to separate subclusters inside the Vordrani swarm. They called the package Lantern Protocol because it did one thing the Hive had never offered: a route out that did not end in silence. Hayes listened to the rollout briefing through interference while tracking burning ships and drifting debris. "Operational effect?" Sullivan answered in clipped sequence. "If even 15% of their units believe D-Link survival is feasible, command cohesion drops faster than physical attrition alone can produce. If 25% believe surrender does not equal cognitive death, forced fight compliance collapses in second-line elements. We are pairing each surrender lane with medical proof and legal guarantees." Elena added from the legal station, "Guarantees are not slogans. Tribunal observer keys are attached. Every boarding action is logged, every detainee registered. If we issue terms, we honor terms." Hayes gave one nod. No one on the bridge mistook for softness. "Execute Lantern across all fronts. Keep saying the same 3 facts: surrender rights, treatment access, brood protections. Repetition beats panic." 47 minutes into the Vordrani withdrawal attempt, the second human strength became visible as clearly as any weapon plume. Humanity was not merely decentralizing tactics, it was decentralizing trust. Engineers, Marines, diplomats, medics, and civilian pilots were operating under a shared legal spine that survived signal blackout and local chaos. Every unit understood the objective in identical moral language, which meant no commander had to guess whether restraint would be backed by force or abandoned for convenience. To the Hive, where ethics were a variable of efficiency, that consistency looked unnatural. To humans, it was standard operating culture. Kareth opened a private channel to a damaged conductor cluster near Beacon 12. "Status." The reply arrived fractured. "Weapons functional. Guidance drift acceptable. Crew requests surrender vector verification." "Denied," Kareth snapped. "Regroup at Cinder Fallback." A long pause followed, then a sentence he had never heard from a subordinate in combat. "Conductor, our relay tech witnessed human D-Link treatment feed. If severance is survivable, what objective justifies continued sacrificial integration?" He cut the channel before he answered, because he had no answer that would survive his own scrutiny. Jack did. Jack always did. The High Commander forced himself onto broad-spectrum Hive authority, overriding local debate with command-grade compulsion. All units receive. Human rescue broadcasts are predatory cognition traps. Any request for surrender is contamination behavior. Units refusing assault directives will be designated defective tissue and recycled after action. Continue advance. Crush corridor assets. Seize medical anchors intact for doctrinal correction. The order restored movement in some sectors through fear alone. In others, fear and uncertainty collided and slowed everything. Human captains saw it immediately, not as triumph, but as a window measured in minutes. Anderson used it without wasting a breath. All Rook elements, hold your fire on powered-down hulls. Mark and bypass. Talon, cut behind their active conductors. We disable command pathways, not frightened crews. Her executive officer glanced at the tactical feed where 3 Vordrani gunships had gone dark with weapons locked safe. Permission to secure those ships now? Negative, Anderson said. Convoys first. If we lose civilians while collecting prisoners, we failed the mission. That choice traveled through human channels with the quiet force of doctrine kept under strain. A destroyer captain on the left flank disengaged from a chase and burned hard toward a damaged refugee cylinder that had slipped from tow. A Marine platoon already inside a Vordrani boarding pod abandoned an easy reactor kill to drag 2 enemy technicians into a pressure-safe corridor before locking down the vessel. At Anchorage 2, Petrov rotated her final fresh trauma team to a civilian docking ring and kept herself in surgery for another cycle because command staff could still stand. A junior officer on Meridian finally asked the question others were thinking and knew better than to phrase emotionally. Sir, we are spending combat tempo on enemy survivability. Is that still net effective while they are trying to reorganize? Hayes looked at the map, where white surrender vectors and red threat cones braided together in constant motion. A primary consideration is what kind of system we are building while we fight. If we win by becoming their mirror, the victory collapses on contact with the next crisis. We hold both lines, or we hold nothing durable. He tapped the display. And, tactically, their doctrine cannot parse this behavior fast enough. Keep moving. Elena heard him and keyed a fleet-wide legal morale address requested by 3 isolated groups whose channels were flickering in and out. Her message ran longer than standard combat packets, and every word was deliberate. For 2 centuries, we have enforced corridor law when it was costly, inconvenient, and politically unpopular. We enforced it because law that applies only in comfort is ceremony, not law. The Vordrani leadership built an empire by teaching their people that personhood is noise and mercy is a defect. You are proving, ship by ship, that discipline and compassion are not rivals. They are a combined system. You are not asked to be kind instead of effective. You are ordered to be both because that is the standard that separates protection from predation. Preserve civilians. Accept surrender. Disable aggressors. Document everything. The galaxy is watching the record form in real time, and the record will outlive this battle. On Kareth's board, the speech appeared as hostile narrative payload and should have been trivial to discard. He discarded it. 10 seconds later, he replayed it from cache without admitting why. The balance shifted harder when Lantern Protocol reached second-line Vordrani logistics crews. Those crews had never been treated as autonomous warfighters, only support tissue bound to command through punishment. When human channels began offering guaranteed repatriation status for non-combatant broods and monitored detention for surrendering crews, logistics captains started making unsanctioned micro-decisions. One barge cut power to its external weapon hardpoints and transmitted a white vector request. Another rotated to screen brood compartments from crossfire, disobeying direct assault routing instructions. A third dumped decoy drones and fled toward a surrender lane without firing. Kareth watched his supposedly rear-stable grid lose obedience one practical choice at a time. Jack, logistics discipline is degrading. We need doctrine adjustment acknowledging selective surrender to preserve remaining combat effectiveness. Jack's return signal hit like a hammer. Denied. There is no selective surrender. There is only function and waste. Any hull broadcasting white vectors is authorized for internal purge. That order, intended to restore terror, detonated what remained of confidence. Conductors who still trusted Jack now faced a command that threatened their own support ships, while humans were publicly guaranteeing brood safety. The contrast was too stark for Hive rhetoric to smooth over. Hesitation became refusal in scattered pockets, then in clusters. 3 minutes later, Sullivan flagged the inflection on human command nets. Admiral, we have a non-trivial split in enemy command intent. Some conductors are still pressing hard. Others are breaking formation to protect logistics and brood barges. Relay traffic shows argument loops where consensus should be instantaneous. Hayes gave the order the fleet had trained for and rarely used. Shift from corridor defense posture to controlled pressure advance. We do not collapse their retreat into civilian lanes. We shepherd active combat units away from non-combatants and strip remaining command spines as they move. Anderson smiled without humor when she heard it. Controlled pressure, she said to her bridge, means we are finally driving this fight instead of surviving it. Helm, Vector Delta Hook. Weapons, precision packages only. Marines, prep boarding on any command hull that keeps firing after disablement. By the 4th hour of continuous engagement, human advantage had stopped being theoretical and started being architectural. Vordrani timing superiority was gone in sectors where quantum noise buoys were active. Their reserve wedges still hit hard when concentrated, but they could not sustain synchronized pressure across the full corridor. Human microgroups, once interpreted as scattered fragments, now moved like interlocking tools in a practiced workshop, each unit making local decisions that reinforced species-level intent. Kareth finally saw the shape of his defeat and hated its elegance. Humanity had not beaten the Hive by out-hiving it. Humanity had made the battlefield too morally and cognitively complex for rigid obedience to remain stable. Every humane act carried military effect. Every military action was constrained by declared principle. Every declaration was backed by visible enforcement. There was nowhere for Vordrani doctrine to stand that did not contradict itself. He opened a secure line to Jack and did what his rank had never required before. Commander, request permission to negotiate bounded withdrawal under Tribunal oversight. We preserve surviving combat mass, retain core territory, and reconstitute under revised doctrine. Jack answered with contempt so cold it felt mechanical. You are proposing capitulation because enemies treated prisoners and showed you operating footage. Your node is compromised. I am proposing survival, Kareth said. You are proposing treason. The channel terminated from Jack's side. Seconds later, fresh command traffic rippled across Vordrani networks. Jack was pulling remaining elite spear groups out of distributed fronts and concentrating them at Elir Gate, the hyperlane junction that controlled deep approach to the inner relief zones. It was a doctrinal gamble bordering on desperation. Abandon broad corridor dominance, mass everything coherent into one decisive break, shatter human command credibility in a single brutal engagement, and reclaim psychological supremacy by spectacle. Hayes received the movement update with no visible surprise, but the bridge quieted around him. Everyone understood what concentration at Elir meant. The skirmish logic of dispersed lanes was ending. The next battle would be set piece, visible to every Tribunal observer and every freight guild in range. If humanity held, Vordrani's strategic initiative died. If humanity failed, all the legal architecture they had defended would be reframed as noble incompetence. Elena read the same data and sent immediate notices to neutral monitors, Allied relief coordinators, and tribunal record offices. Fordrani High Command was massing combat assets near a civilian critical junction after documented attacks on protected lanes. She attached full evidence trails from first warning to present engagement, each citation cross-checked and immutable. On Anchorage 2, Petrov walked out of surgery for the first time in hours and accepted a fresh slate. The numbers were brutal but clear. Evacuation, throughput holding, civilian survival climbing, enemy detainee survival above projected thresholds. She signed transfer orders for stabilized Fordrani patients to guarded treatment ships and looked up as the long-range board lit with new tracks bending toward Ilir Gate. "That is where they will try to prove we were bluffing," she said. "No," answered a tired pilot beside her, watching the same lights gather. "That is where they find out we were not." Across Carthay, human units pivoted in disciplined arcs, not chasing fleeing remnants, not overextending into easy traps, but converging on the junction where Jack had staked what remained of Fordrani command authority. White surrender lanes stayed active behind them. Medical channels stayed open. Boarding teams rearmed. Quantum noise buoys were repacked for redeployment. The corridor they had been ordered to hold was no longer collapsing. It was becoming a controlled rear zone under human protection. Ahead, Ilir Gate brightened with the signatures of a final concentration, and both species moved toward the confrontation that would decide whose doctrine wrote the next law of war. The junction sat inside a scarred volume of space, where old industrial collisions had left a rotating debris shear, dense enough to confuse targeting at long range and too unstable for civilian traffic under normal conditions. Human traffic control had cleared it hours earlier and filed every legal notice in tribunal format. Jack interpreted the clear zone as fear. Hayes interpreted it as geometry. On the Concord of One Will, High Commander Jack watched human markers arrange around the gate in what looked like a defensive crescent anchored by hospital hulls and relief tenders. White humanitarian glyphs shone in hard contrast against gunmetal carrier silhouettes farther back. He tasted vindication and sent it through every surviving conductor channel. "Observe them," he said, voice amplified across the lattice. "They hide warships behind infirmary symbols because they cannot bear decisive loss. We will split their screen at the medline, seize command personnel, and convert their corridors into integration lanes. There will be no second correction cycle." Kareth, patched into the command chorus from a damaged relay ship on Jack's left wing, studied latency values that were already moving the wrong way. He requested one final caution. "Commander, their previous engagements used legal signals as tactical anchors. Assume layered traps around every protected marker. Recommend probes before mass commitment." Jack did not turn. "Your caution has become superstition. Commit all spear groups." On the Meridian, Hayes heard the Fordrani surge begin before the tactical board completed the update. Thousands of hostile vectors accelerated in mathematically clean wedges, all aimed at the humanitarian line. He gave no dramatic cue, only a sequence every unit had memorized. Execute Trident frame. Decoys hold lawful posture until burn line. Mines wake on my tone. Frigates begin buoy seating in their wake corridors. Carriers, electromagnetic lances only unless explicit override. We disable, board, and silence, relay, command. Elena stood at the legal station, transmitting the same 3 terms she had repeated since the tribunal chamber. Surrender lanes remain open. Brood civilian craft remain protected. Any unit that powers weapons down will be boarded for detention and medical stabilization, not execution. She sent it on military bands, civilian channels, and tribunal observer frequencies at once. No one could claim later that they had not heard. 93 minutes after the first tracks converged on Elir, the decoy hospital ships executed their turn. To Vordrani targeting logic, it looked like panic, vulnerable hulls pulling away from impact. In reality, each ship burned along a pre-mapped corridor that led straight across the outer edge of the debris shear, where dormant mine clusters had sat cold inside lawful exclusion zones. Jack gave pursuit authorization with visible satisfaction. 3 spear fleets entered the shear at full thrust. Hayes touched the activation key. The minefield did not erupt in indiscriminate fire. It woke in disciplined chains, kinetic bursts and directional pulses hitting drive cones, relay masts, and sensor spines rather than life support cores. Vordrani formations lost shape at once. Lead ships pitched off axis, trailing sparks and ion haze, while following ranks tried to correct into corridors that no longer existed as stable vectors. Debris rotation amplified the damage, turning precise wedges into stumbling clusters that fire through their own interference. Before those clusters could resynchronize, human stealth frigates rose from shadow behind fractured ore masses and released quantum noise buoys in tight spirals. The buoys ignited without light, a silent distortion that thickened command delay by fractions of seconds across the Vordrani lattice. Fractions became failures. A flank order arrived after the flank had moved. Target confirmations returned against stale coordinates. Conductor ships requested consensus and received 3 contradictory answers. Kareth felt the chorus tear into argument loops and understood with exhausted clarity that this was the exact failure mode he had warned about. All conductors, he transmitted, break centralized tempo, shift to local command segmentation, prioritize withdrawal from noise volumes. Half acknowledged, half could not. Jack overrode him, flooding authority compulsion through command channels that were no longer fully obedient. No retreat. Collapse their decoys. Burn through. Then, the heavy human carriers fired. Electromagnetic lances crossed the junction in disciplined volleys, blue-white spears that crawled over Vordrani hulls and left them dark, drifting, intact. Weapon grids failed. Engines coughed into silence. Command decks went blind without decompressing into vacuum. It was brutal in effect and restrained in design, a deliberate refusal to take the shortest lethal path. Every disabled Vordrani vessel opened another boarding opportunity and another live witness to human terms. On Anderson's bridge, status lights changed from red to amber in sectors that had looked unwinnable an hour before. Talon. Pin that conductor. Rook. Bypass powered down hulls and cut the relay pair behind them. Marines. Boarding priority is command spines and scuttle control nodes. Do not touch brood barges unless fired upon, and if fired upon, disable propulsion only. Her executive officer pointed to a cluster of logistics barges tucked behind Jack's reserve line. We could end this faster by cracking those support hulls. And hand him our hypocrisy as a final weapon, Anderson replied. Negative. Keep them off the target queue. At Anchorage 2's forward triage relay, Petrov watched incoming telemetry from boarding teams and treatment ships. Vordrani D-Link trauma admissions spiked as synchronization failed across whole wedges. She routed reserves and sent one sentence to command that carried equal parts medicine and strategy. Stabilization capacity remains viable if capture tempo stays staggered. If they collapse all at once, we lose survivability margins. Hayes adjusted boarding cadence within minutes, proof that doctrine still listened to clinicians during decisive battle. By the 4th hour at Elir Gate, the galaxy was watching in full. Neutral freight guilds mirrored live tactical overlays. Tribunal observers logged every surrender call and every response. Allied relief species transmitted voluntary witness statements from protected corridors that were still open under fire. The narrative Jack had promised, disciplined superiority crushing sentimental fragments, had inverted on every screen in real time. Hayes opened broad-spectrum command, voice level and unmistakably final. For 2 centuries, humanity treated surrender rights, medical neutrality, and civilian corridors as law, not preference. We enforced those standards when convenient and when costly. You called that weakness. You called it inefficiency. You called it guilt. Listen carefully. We have been patient long enough for every witness in this galaxy to see who fired on medlines, who hunted evac traffic, and who still opened treatment decks to enemy wounded. We are not asking for moral approval. We are enforcing a boundary, a power down weapons and enter white vectors now, and you will live under detention and due process. Continue firing from command hulls, and we will dismantle your capacity to command, ship by ship, node by node, until silence is all that remains. He closed the channel and gave one operational order. Board the Concord. 3 Marine breaching groups detached from human destroyers and drove toward Jack's flagship through a corridor of disabled Vordrani escorts. The Concord of One Will was built like a fortress spine, layered armor around a central cognition chamber where Jack's command interfaces nested in redundant rings. Vordrani point defense still functioned on local loops and cut 1 boarding shuttle into spinning wreckage before the other 2 reached Hull. The surviving Marines clamped on, burned entry circles through plated alloy, and entered under rolling jammer cover. Inside, resistance was fierce and disciplined, even as the outer lattice failed. Vordrani Guard cadres fought in short corridors lit by emergency crimson, trying to buy seconds for command recovery. Human Marines moved with compressed efficiency, stun bursts, and controlled fire, advancing toward relay cores rather than chasing every defender. Their objective was not vengeance. It was control. Lieutenant Commander Victor Barrett led the 2nd breach stack into the cognition spine and found Jack already sealed behind armored pedals, conduit cables feeding into cranial ports along the commander's neck ridges. Barrett keyed external comm. Hi, Commander Jack. This is United Human Marines. Your command vessel is encircled. Your relay architecture is compromised. Open the chamber and surrender. You will be taken alive under tribunal warrant. Jack's answer came through metal, contempt wrapped around strain. I do not surrender to fragments. Barrett signaled his engineer. Cutting torches bit into the chamber seam in 6 synchronized points, while jammer teams smothered outgoing command bursts. Inside the Concorde, alarms shifted from combat status to reactor security warnings as Jack attempted emergency self-scuttle authorization through residual hive code. In Vault 7, Sullivan saw the attempt hit quarantine filters and fail. Human cyber crews had isolated Concord command loops from external ignition chains minutes before boarding began. Scuttle packet blocked, Sullivan reported to Hayes. He has no ignition path. The chamber pedals fell inward with a heavy clang. Jack rose from the interface cradle, taller than any Marine in the room, armored plating cracked, throat ports flashing erratic command light without a chorus to answer. He lunged for a side console, one last effort to trigger something catastrophic, and took 2 shock round center mass that dropped him to 1 knee without killing him. Barrett's team closed, locked restraint bands over his forelimbs and neck ports, and cut every remaining uplink cable. On the Meridian, tribunal observers demanded immediate visual confirmation. Hayes approved. They brought Jack to the Concorde's primary command deck, now secured by human Marines and flooded with hard white light for uninterrupted recording integrity. Elena stood to one side with legal officers. Hayes stood opposite Jack in fleet gray, expression carved from fatigue and certainty. Across the live feed, 72 delegations watched the commander who had promised integration, now held upright by restraints. Jack lifted his head and hissed through damaged ports, voice still carrying venom. Your mercy is malfunction, Hayes answered without raising his voice. No, Commander, it is policy, and now it is your prison. Jack tried one final time, subvocal code pulsing through neck ports in a rapid sequence meant to wake dormant scuttle routines. Nothing happened. Sullivan's quarantine held. The command deck remained steady. No reactor bloom came. No heroic annihilation rescued his doctrine. For the first time since the tribunal session, Jack's silence was not chosen. Elena stepped forward and read the binding charges into the live record. Attacks on protected medical lanes, deliberate strikes on civilian evacuation vectors, coercive integration threats against independent personnel, and command authorization of unlawful force under treaty law. Each charge carried time-stamped evidence from open channels and captured Vordrani logs. She finished with the disposition order ratified by emergency tribunal majority 10 minutes earlier. High Commander Jack of the Vordrani War Lattice is remanded to permanent interstellar custody, pending war crimes sentence execution under supervised confinement. Command authority is revoked. All remaining Vordrani units are instructed to power down and accept detention protocols. Non-combatant protections remain in effect. Kareth, listening from a crippled relay ship adrift beyond Elir's inner ring, received the authenticated capture code through channels that no longer had a commander to deny it. He looked at his fractured tactical board, at powered-down ships waiting in white vectors, at brood barges still untouched by human fire, and gave the order he had resisted for hours. All units under my remaining authority, weapons safe. Transmit surrender ident. Follow white lanes. Medical requests authorized for all D-Link casualties. One by one, then in clusters, Vordrani signatures went dark across Ilir Gate. By local dawn cycle, the junction was silent except for rescue traffic, tow operations, and the clipped cadence of boarding confirmations. The Vordrani War Lattice was disarmed, segmented, and encircled. Human artillery had never fired on brood civilian barges, though several had drifted into tempting lines of fire. The Concord of One Will sat under guard with its command spine removed intact, repurposed by human signal teams into a surrender broadcaster that repeated the same terms on loop. Power down, survive, submit to law. As Jack was transferred in restraints to a hardened custody shuttle, he looked once through the viewport at the field of disabled ships and marked white corridors, at enemies who had defeated him without becoming him, and said nothing at all. The custody shuttle hatch sealed on High Commander Jack, and for the first time in 12 hours the command deck noise dropped below combat volume. Then a proximity alarm cut through the quiet. A Vordrani heavy frigate, engines half dead and weapons still hot, broke from a surrender queue and accelerated toward a knot of logistics barges carrying brood civilians and wounded detainees. On the Meridian, a tactical officer looked up from the board and said what everyone saw. If that frigate reaches detonation range, it takes the whole cluster with it. A weapons chief answered with grim efficiency. Cleanest solution is a spinal strike through the core. Guaranteed kill. Hayes kept his eyes on the collision clock. Negative. Core strike risks. Chain rupture through brood compartments. We are not finishing this war by validating his doctrine. He switched to command broadcast. All units, this is Fleet Command. Rogue target designation Black Spear. Disable propulsion and fire control only. Boarding teams prepare for hostile seizure. Brood barges are absolute no-fire zones. Anderson heard the order and rerouted 3 destroyers into a narrowing intercept cone that gave them no margin for mistakes. Her first volley peeled the frigate's dorsal emitters without breaching the pressure hull. The second lance took steering fins. The target kept driving forward on brute thrust, committed now to impact. She exhaled once and spoke into marine comms. Barrett, you have 30 seconds before contact. Take their bridge or they die, and so do the civilians behind them. Barrett's surviving shuttle came in low along the frigate's shadow and slammed clamps onto scorched armor. Inside, the corridors were smoke gray and strobing emergency amber. Vordrani holdouts fired from hard corners. Human Marines answered with disciplined shock fire and shield pushes, stepping over fallen weapons rather than finishing wounded opponents. Barrett reached the bridge hatch, cut through, and found Vordrani tactical conductor Kareth wired into a manual detonation interlock. One arm braced across the trigger bus while two trembling junior technicians fought him under cascading D-Link alarms. Moments earlier, he had broadcast weapons safe surrender. Now, contradictory bridge loops had collapsed into a physical struggle over the kill circuit. Barrett dropped his rifle muzzle 2 centimeters. You are isolated. Jack is in custody. Your scuttle codes are quarantined. Release the loop, and you live. Kareth's mandibles tightened. Life as fragment is degradation. Life as fragment is still life, Barrett said. And your brood is behind you, not behind us. The technician on the left, younger by ridge pattern and shaking hard, disengaged first. Then the second. Kareth held 3 seconds longer to verify the loop stayed cold, then tore his own cable free and collapsed against the console. Barrett signaled all clear. Outside, the rogue frigate drifted off the impact line and spun harmlessly into tow range. At Anchorage 2, Pishrov met the first wave from that ship herself. Kareth came in restrained, neural ports burned, identity markers flickering from D-Link shock. She recognized him from captured command logs before the intake nurse finished the scan. Kareth, she said, you argued for bounded withdrawal. He stared at her, disoriented and furious at his own survival. You archived that. We archived everything, Petrov replied, including your surrender order. He expected interrogation. He got a trauma blanket, monitored sedation, and a surgeon from Earth standing opposite a Kythi volunteer anesthetist under the same operating lights. On the table beside him lay 2 human crew and 1 Vordrani technician, all triaged by the same protocol chart. Petrov pointed at the chart, not unkindly. Priority by physiology and time to failure. No species modifiers. You called that inefficiency. Watch it keep you alive. By the second recovery cycle at Elir, human treatment ships held more Vordrani wounded than human wounded. No one hit it. Elena ordered daily transparent tallies to tribunal monitors and neutral freight unions, each signed by independent medical auditors. Captured relay spines from the Concord and 3 conductor hulls were sealed, chain of custody logged, and transferred to spiral forensic vaults. Sullivan's team submitted the blocked scuttle packet, Jack's rejection orders, and the private taunt messages as authenticated war crimes exhibits. Even the petty officer's unauthorized medic broadcast was formally entered, not buried. Context notes showed it had accelerated surrender compliance and reduced deaths on both sides. The spiral tribunal reconvened under emergency mandate with the same dome rotating overhead. But the chamber geometry no longer belonged to Vordrani architecture. Jack appeared by secured hollow feet from permanent custody, restraints visible, command ports inert behind isolation bands. Tharn, the prosecutor mind who had opened with contempt, now spoke through 1 active helm instead of 6, the composite visibly diminished by political collapse. Elena stood at center dais and delivered the record in a voice that did not rise once. The United Human Systems submit complete evidence that the Vordrani war lattice attacked protected medical lanes, targeted evacuation corridors, and attempted forced integration of independent personnel. We also submit full operational logs showing reciprocal compliance with surrender law, treatment of enemy wounded, and protection of brood civilians under fire. Humanity requests sentence for commanders who ordered violations, structural dissolution of coercive war authority, and legal reform binding every member polity, including ours, to enforceable humanitarian standards. A Valari jurist from the outer ring leaned forward, crystalline voice carrying through the hall. Ambassador Morrison, does your government seek punitive extermination authority over the Vordrani military caste? No, Elena answered immediately. We seek accountability for architects of atrocity and survivable reintegration for those coerced into execution. Justice is not arithmetic revenge. It is durable order. Hayes testified next, concise and coldly precise. He played the corridor warnings with timestamps, Jack's explicit rejections, and the command logs authorizing strikes on medical markers. Then he played the counter record. Surrender lanes kept open during active combat, brood barges preserved despite tactical cost, and treatment decks receiving enemy casualties while battle damage still burned on their own hulls. He ended with the sentence that settled the chamber. Power without restraint is predation. Restraint without enforcement is theater. We brought both. The vote was not close. Combat efficiency statutes were suspended that day and repealed in final session after review. Jack received permanent interstellar imprisonment under war crimes sentence, no command access, no relay contact, no parole mechanism. Senior Vordrani conductors who had ordered corridor attacks were convicted and remanded to supervise labor reconstruction in devastated transit zones. Units that had surrendered early, including Kareth's surviving command cluster, entered monitored demilitarization and civilian repatriation tracks. 6 months later, the chamber filled again for ratification of the Carthai Accords. The new document was not symbolic language dressed as law. It carried inspection triggers, enforcement mandates, shared jurisdiction, and automatic sanctions for any force that weaponized protected corridors. Medical neutrality became cross-polity doctrine. Civilian evacuation lanes became inviolable under binding penalty. Individual personhood rights were codified even for former hive castes, including legal identity registration independent of collective command. Kareth attended in person. Thinner, ports scarred, now designated transitional liaison rather than conductor. When called, he approached the witness rail with visible effort and gave a statement the old hive would have erased. We were taught that mercy increases casualties by preserving resistance, he said. Evidence from Carthai and Elir shows the reverse under constrained law. Surrender certainty reduced terminal fighting. Medical treatment reduced retaliatory escalation. Protection of brood civilians removed the panic incentives that drove our worst tactical decisions. The doctrine I enforced was not strength. It was fragility, disguised as control. No one applauded in the chamber. The silence was heavier and more respectful than applause. Outside law, the practical aftermath held. Human engineers and Vordrani civilians rebuilt relay-independent transport networks with tribunal oversight. The Keethi volunteer crews who had held operating tables through the worst hours signed a long-term medical exchange with Anchorage, too. Independent relief guilds that had once been hunted in corridors now ran protected convoys under mixed escorts. The rogue frigate from Black Spear, stripped of weapons, became a training hulk for D-Link trauma teams and command ethics courses. Nothing collected in battle remained unaccounted for. Mines were mapped and cleared. Quantum noise buoys were inventoried and either deactivated or transferred to emergency interdiction stock under joint seal. Concord's command spine stayed in forensic archive, then moved to a public legal museum wing with every casualty number engraved beside it. When the tribunal confirmed stewardship of the new interstellar humanitarian fleet, Elena and Hayes stood together on the Meridian's rebuilt observation deck, while dockyards below repainted hull markings from ad hoc corridor symbols to formal Accord insignia. The designation was armed guarantor status, not conquest authority. Every signatory, human included, accepted inspection by the same standards. A junior signals officer, the same one who had swallowed hard when Jack first answered with contempt, approached with the final authenticated transcript packet. "Ma'am, Admiral, Tribunal Archive accepted all exhibits. No redactions requested. Final line is locked." Elena took the slate, read it once, and passed it to Hayes. The line sat plain against the dark screen. Humanity had been found guilty of compassion, and the galaxy had been found wrong. At dusk cycle over Luna Defense Ring, convoy beacons lit in patient lines and crossed open space without escorts, clustering in fear. Medical ships from 12 species moved lane to lane under shared law. Children on station school decks pressed their hands to viewports and counted hulls they no longer had to classify as targets. Hayes watched the traffic settle into its new rhythm, then turned back to the bridge where officers from former enemy and former ally stood the same watch and gave the quiet order that closed the campaign for good. "Log Carthay operation complete. Maintain the corridor.